Origin Jazz Reacts, and this is: was the USSR actually a union or just another Russian empire? Short animated documentary by channel History Matters. It's been a while since I did a History Matters video, so this is going to be interesting. The leaders of the Soviet Union firmly considered themselves to be in control of a union of equals, whereas many of those in the West considered to little more than a continuation of the Russian Empire it replaced. That is such a true point, right? European Union is a union, and it feels like a union, right? Well, USSR, didn't Russia mostly dictated a lot of things, right? I mean, that's where it all was, right? USSR always felt like Russia and its buffer states. In the end, it was all St. Petersburg and Moscow, right? So in a way, USSR was an empire, right? I mean, most people didn't have a say in it, right? It was part of a communism tactic, right? You can say it wasn't real communism, and just like you can already hear fat Russians screaming. But yeah, that is what communism always turns into, like dictatorship type of way. Like at least the part, like if there is no one dictator, there's like party of dictators or whatever. But it's in the end, dictation is there, right? So it was definitely was an empire. Right, so yeah, it wasn't much of a union. It was an empire, right? It probably started as a union, but it definitely ended up as an empire, I think. But obviously, History Matters is going to go into more detail than this. This USSR video or Russia video from History Matters is always interesting. I don't know why there's like a different feel to it. But yeah, this is going to be interesting. Let's watch it.
Union proudly presented itself as a nation made up of equal republics and peoples, but from the outside it was often viewed as a Russo-centric empire, in which the diktats from Moscow were violently enforced upon the periphery. So which was it? Was the Soviet Union really a union, or was it just another Russian empire? Now, empire is obviously quite difficult to define, but if the USSR were a Russian empire, then it would have some features similar to other empires. It would of course have a metropole from which many decisions were made on behalf of people that had no say there. Wealth would flow from the periphery to the centre, at which there would be a single ethnic group which would benefit the most. This group would then also export or force their own language and culture onto those under their control, and would use violence to prevent them from leaving. So to what extent did...
Hold up, is that what empire means? Wasn't Roman Empire Roman because, it controlled Rome? In the early stages, it kind of like controlled Rome and like things around it slightly, right? I mean, the Roman Empire didn't become like a giant empire that we knew of right away. I thought empire just basically just another, where there's an emperor in the head of it, it's an empire, right? Like monarchy or something. That's all what I always assume. So in this case, USSR, basically all the countries the USSR has, there was one central figure, Moscow. There wasn't one emperor, but it was kind of like that, especially with the Stalin, it turned into emperorship type of way, right? So it was always one body that dictated things. In this case, Kremlin, Moscow, whatever. So isn't that what empire is?
These things exist in the USSR. Well, obviously that depends on which period is being looked at. In the early years, the new Soviet government was kind of a mess. It tried to reinvent the way that government worked whilst also having to run the country using the old administration from the Russian Empire. After things had settled and Lenin had been thoroughly mummified, Stalin was in charge and he had plans. Now, Stalin considered himself...
I like how he says that like that was the goal. People actually mummified Lenin alive or something to get rid of him. I like that sentence, how it has implication like that.
An expert on ethnicity and culture within the USSR, and so he sought to head off any potential upsets. He himself was Georgian, but that didn't mean that he was opposed to the centrality of the Russian people and language within the USSR. Lenin had previously ordered that local languages be taught across the country, whereas Stalin wanted to make sure that Russian was still the central language of communism. The idea being that local identities were fine, but a collective identity was needed and would be created through the teaching of Russian. In terms of economics, the USSR was fairly even-handed when it came to things like infrastructure. Things like...
Yeah, I don't think the language differences would be that big of a deal, because in India, there was Mughal Empire, basically Islamic states, basically came to India and like dominated, right? Mughals, they are called. Babur was the first one, and then his generation. So the Mughal Empire was an empire, but obviously in India, everybody spoke different languages, including the Mughals themselves. Mughal didn't dictate it, like everybody speaks their language, Urdu or whatever that was around that time. because they knew there would be too much of a mess, and they still like, okay, every few hundred kilometers, every few hundred miles or whatever, people speak different languages. So language part isn't that necessary, I think.
Like factories were often built outside of Russia proper, which brought a lot of money and jobs to the regions around. Furthermore, the internal borders of the USSR were often adjusted along ethnic lines, which led to Russia losing territory to its sister socialist republics. In terms of how much freedom the non-Russian governments had, it was mixed. Now obviously, everyone was subject to the same Stalinist repression. However, if a leader of a republic was a close friend with Stalin, then they were given much more individual freedom on how to run the place. If Stalin didn't like you, oh boy. And he didn't really like the Baltic states. These three...
I mean, just because Stalin likes you doesn't mean you have your own freedom. You're still doing things that Stalin likes, otherwise he would not like you now. Back to Gulag and like paintbrush, there you go.
Had been independent for over 20 years by the time the USSR annexed them, and to put it bluntly, they weren't happy with this new arrangement. As such, Stalin made sure to relocate Russians to the Baltics to make sure that there was always a population loyal to Moscow. A similar story applied to the territories Moscow gained from Poland in 1945. Many Ukrainians and Poles were forcibly...
I like how Russia still does that shit, right? They did that in Crimea in recent time. Right, a lot of people always, that is a goal. Even China does that a lot. That entire new towns suddenly brings up in a new places they suddenly claim, right? Entire, like, you know, in Himalayan, I don't know which video I saw, was it? I don't know which video I saw, but in the Himalayas, like entire Chinese towns are built from scratch. Like, okay, just move population there, so that's yours now. Who's gonna like say no now? That's some next level shit. The people actually obliging to that. That's some next level shit.
Removed from their homelands, and those that resisted either ended up in the gulags or pits. So, did running a country centered in Russia benefit Russia and the Russians? Well, yes, depending on where in Russia you were exactly. For many of those living across Russia, especially the east, their lives weren't that much better than those living in, say, Georgia or Belarus. Wages were based on what sector you worked in, but for the most part, those that lived in Moscow or Leningrad were much better off. And this was the case across most of the life of the USSR. Whilst Russia held greater prestige...
Well, that's the case with all the empires and emperors and kings of the past. Who benefit, like, people benefits were necessary, right? So Moscow benefited. Basically Kremlin, which was the emperor, let's just say collective emperor, Stalin, whatever time period, like I said, they were benefiting, they were the core of it, so that makes them empire, right?
Prestige at the centre of the USSR, its people lived similar lives to those in the rest of the country. For many of those who lived outside of Russia, the USSR certainly felt like a Russian empire, but the beneficiaries of this empire weren't the Russian ethnicity, but those who lived in major cities all across the Soviet Union. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker, Sky Chappelle, Katoitska, Yuduan Wang, Anthony Beckett, Marcus Arsner, Rod D. Martin.
I was really hoping for him to do that paintbrush thing in the end clip, but apparently it's just, what is it, Stalin? But yeah, there you go. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man, right? This is one of those questions, like, I mean, how do you see things matters, I guess. I don't know, but yeah, it was kind of an empire. To me, it was a kind of an empire, because for me, empire always means like one central empire, just, you know, like it's like monarchy type of way, right? Like one central figure, an emperor, or in this case, Kremlin, dictating things whether you like it or not. They are the one who's profiting. So it's an empire, centrally driven, one unit empire basically. So it was driven by Moscow, the whole place, dictated by Moscow. So yeah. Right, well, if you like, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.